If you've ever wondered whether waiting in a romantic relationship is just a matter of how conservative or liberal a couple is, or if this idea actually has some neurobiological foundation, then this video is for you. Let's have a look. In men, the initiation of physical intimacy, testosterone, and vasopressin are linked in a precisely tuned biological loop that directs the behavior before, during, and after physical intimacy. And this dynamic beautifully explains the transition from wild drive to long-term attachment. Now, the algorithm is being really sensitive, so I'll just be using the term physical intimacy today. So the first phase, let's call it the courtship phase. During the first phase, the arousal and the courtship phase, testosterone is the main player in the male body. Testosterone turns on the libido, or the desire for physical intimacy, in the brain and motivates the man to take action. Now, interestingly, high levels of testosterone are actually, they slightly reduce the effects of oxytocin and consequently empathy. This allows the man to adopt an even more focused and instrumental and confident behavior necessary for pursuit and achieving his goal. And then the second phase, let's call it the shift during intimacy. So when physical intimacy begins, the neurological landscape in the male brain shifts drastically. Just as women release a large amount of oxytocin, a man's body and brain release a massive wave of vasopressin at that moment. And oxytocin is also released, but vasopressin has a stronger behavior influence in men. Now, number 3, post-intimacy transition. So once physical intimacy is over, the levels of dopamine and testosterone drop drastically, while a high level of vasopressin remains in the body, and this neurochemical shift changes the man's focus. Because testosterone, which drives the urge and competitiveness, drops while vasopressin stays high, vasopressin is supposed to trigger what neuroscientists call the instinct to protect the partner or mate guardian, and it's related to monogamy and things like that. Now, a comparison, first date versus after a few weeks. A neurobiological view of physical intimacy on a first date compared to physical intimacy after a few weeks reveals a fascinating dynamic, especially when observing what's happening with vasopressin levels in interaction with other hormones. The main difference is not whether vasopressin is released, because it's released in both scenarios, but rather the neurochemical terrain into which that vasopressin is poured and how that impacts both the male and female brain. So let's have a look at the first scenario when physical intimacy happens on the first date. What actually happens is a dopamine fire. When it comes to physical intimacy on the first date, the brains of both people are dominated by dopamine, completely dominated by dopamine, which is the hormone of novelty, reward, euphoria, motivation, striving, pursuit, and testosterone, which is, let's call it, the sex drive hormone. In men, a massive wave of vasopressin is released, but because of really high levels of testosterone and dopamine, the brain is in a state of pursuit, chase, reward. Because no emotional history or safety has been built with the woman prior to this day, the brain often interprets this vasopressin wave simply through the mechanism of a short-term biological victory or short-term mating. The instinct for protection and lasting loyalty is rarely activated because the dopamine crash after physical intimacy is very drastic and quickly returns the man to a neutral state. There can even be a drop in attraction once the dopamine fades. and the dopamine crash signals very strongly the reward has been won. So what happens in women? A woman also releases a huge amount of oxytocin and some vasopressin, but because oxytocin reduces the activity of the amygdala, which is the fear center, and increases trust, the woman can quickly open up and bond biologically. If this happens on a first date, the hormonal cocktail can cause the woman's brain to unrealistically idealize the man, even though rationally she doesn't really know much about him. So if a couple waits a few weeks before they begin physical intimacy, something crucial happens in the meantime. So through conversations, shared experiences, baseline levels of oxytocin and vasopressin begin to rise gradually and stably. The man's brain is no longer strictly in a hunting mode, and it's building the foundations of safety. When sexual intercourse occurs after a few weeks, that massive wave of vasopressin pours into a terrain that has already been sensitized by the occasional release of this hormone during courtship. And because the man already knows this woman, non-sexual associations with her have formed in his memory. And the flood of vasopressin now doesn't just trigger sexual satisfaction, but it acts as a biological seal on an already existing attachment. And in this scenario, that nest protecting instinct and selective monogamy truly activate in the man. And in women, since her trust is already grounded in real-world experiences, sexual intercourse and the accompanying oxytocin wave no longer act as a shock to the system, but rather as a natural deepening of an already existing emotional bond. And the connection between sexuality and safety is maximized. So I personally find it really interesting when science catches up and some ideas that people intuitively know and feel are confirmed by research. But some people are probably really going to dislike this video. As always, you can let me know in the comments. I'm open to a debate, and perhaps you can also find research that's showing completely different results, which is possible. I hope you've learned something interesting. I hope you're doing well and taking care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.